You are the product lead at KlimaDAO.
That's correct. Yeah, I'm a core member focused primarily on product and partnerships.
Excellent, excellent. So I have a whole long list of like the things that you do, right? You do product and partnerships. The company has kickstarted a decentralized and open market for carbon token incentives, investors, citizens, and organizations to participate in and govern this new economy, which is a lot of words.
Yeah,
I'm wondering if you might be able to like break it down for us a little bit and tell us what is KlimaDAO? Maybe we can kind of start with that.
Yeah, definitely. So what KlimaDAO is essentially doing is creating a new carbon market on chain. Initially, we created incentives to bridge over 25 million tons of carbon credits on chain, and we'll get a little bit into what carbon credits are.
Yeah.
But it's enough to say that that's a large number of credits in a short amount of time, just over around 7 months, 6 to 7 months. Mm-hmm. During that, we helped facilitate over $2 billion worth of transactions, which doubled the traditional voluntary carbon market volume, total transaction volume in half the time. So this was like a very powerful, big impact essentially.
Yeah.
Not only just in crypto in terms of a real world use case, but in the voluntary carbon market itself, which is just over 10 years old, more or less. And so we had a lot of eyes on us at that point. We were written up in all the press. We built our community up to over 40,000 members, and it was just really hectic and crazy. It was really fun, right? It was really great. And so that was kind of like our first act. From there, we then really just started focusing on building demand and utility for on-chain carbon itself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we're gonna have to unpeel that onion a little bit more, and so I honestly don't know exactly what is a carbon market. A market implies you're buying and selling something.
Right.
Carbon, though, is like an atom. I'm assuming that we're talking about carbon dioxide, which is like the offset of energy production in a lot of cases, right? And just kind of life as we know it.
Yeah, so the best way to think about it is, as humans, we've gotten really good at figuring out the cost of production, right? So we know, using markets globally, we know how much it costs to extract resources out of the ground, package them into products, deliver those products anywhere around the world. Like, we've gotten really good at the cost of production. What we've been terrible at so far is the cost of destruction or the cost of that impact, right? And so if you were to try to factor in not just the cost of what it takes to create a bunch of, say, plastic straws, like the real cost of the impact of those straws in the environment, well, then you need some kind of way to measure that. And so carbon itself isn't the perfect measure across, all products and activity, but it's a pretty good proxy. Because everything that we do and create contains carbon, right? And so primarily when we talk about carbon credits, each carbon credit represents a ton of CO2.
Okay.
And essentially how they get created is there's various types of projects, but some of the most popular examples are, imagine you have some acres of forestry, and you could cut down those trees. You could harvest them for paper if you wanted to. You could cut them down and put a ranch there for, say, cattle, beef, or something, right? You could do that. And you can model out, okay, the value of that acre of land, say for paper, is going to earn you whatever, say $20 per year per acre, something to that effect. And so that's profitable at scale. Now, the alternative to that is, what if you didn't cut down that acre of forest?
Right.
So then you would say, okay, let's say it's pinewood forest, right? The pinewood forest over a 25-year period of time, that's how long it takes for these trees to mature, they would capture a certain amount of CO2 out of the air, because that's how trees build themselves, right? I mean, it's literally just pulling carbon, add some nutrients in there, and the tree itself is formed out of carbon, and so that's a type of carbon capture. So the question is can you create an economic incentive so that you can at least match or beat the reverse of that, which would be to exploit that land? Can you make money by just saving that land, by just maintaining it and ensuring that it doesn't get cut down or it doesn't burn down, that these types of things? And if you're able to do that, then what happens is this incentive naturally starts to begin to act like this balancing. So somewhere else in the world, you're emitting tons of carbon, and in other places of the world, you're saving forests to help mitigate that usage that you're using. And so the primary method in which this trade happens essentially is through carbon credits. And so you would have this forestry project, you would register it with various registries, and there's these international standards that define, things such as additionality, which essentially is, would this forest be cut down anyways, or would it just continue to stand? Well, if it's going to continue to stand, then it doesn't really make sense to assign credits to it. But if it's under economic pressure, like, there's a ranch nearby and it's going to get cut down, then it makes sense to say, okay, this complies with these standards, and so for every year that this exists, a certain amount of carbon credits are going to be created. At that point, companies like Microsoft and Google, Stripe, et cetera, very large companies that have a large carbon footprint would then go to the market and purchase those credits. And so in that way, the people that are managing that acreage of forest are getting paid to not exploit it.
Wow. Okay. So I want to make sure I restate that.
Yeah.
So let's imagine I'm a farmer and I happen to have some part of my acreage is in forest, right? And so I have like this maybe mixed use estate, 100 acres or so, maybe 50 of it's woods. And I could choose to cut down those woods to make more land to raise various livestock. Or I could say, hey, like, do you want me to like not cut that down? And I could get paid to like not cut it down.
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly it. And so then the idea is like, okay, well, as it becomes more important for companies to become carbon neutral or even climate positive, the demand for that carbon increases. So that naturally means that the price per ton starts to increase of these credits. And that in turn generates more demand for these projects to save more forest or to, there's various forms in which you can generate these credits, but we'll stick to the forest example, to save more forest, right? But what that also means is right now as a corporation, your first rule, your first goal should really be about how do you reduce your footprint. So what are you doing operationally that is more wasteful than it needs to be? Or where could you introduce efficiencies into the system so that you're using less materials, for example, or you're more efficient in how you route your shipping, for another example. But some of these changes, they take years and they're very expensive. And so offsetting through carbon credits first acts as like a stopgap measure. But also as the price of this carbon increases over time, then it actually gives you the economic pressure you need to actually invest in these projects internally that would actually make your use of materials more efficient. And going back to this idea of the cost of production and the cost of destruction, what happens then is because you're starting to price carbon itself, what then happens is now you have a native way to put this into your operating costs, right? So we know, again, the cost of production, very easy to calculate. Now is this new market in this new modality of understanding cost, total impact costs, now you can bring that into your finances as well, and now you can model it along both dimensions.
So this is something I'd like to understand a little bit better too, is like the kind of the purchase side of things, right? So like you were saying that there are corporations that want to use less materials. Like sometimes we hear about this with Apple or whatnot. They'll say, oh, we've found a new way to billet the aluminum so that it's actually producing less waste when we're creating like the frames of our laptops, that kind of stuff. I'm assuming that that's in alignment with what you were talking about before about like less wasteful production mechanisms. And am I understanding it correctly that these companies are volunteering into purchasing these carbon offset credits as a way of showing responsibility and also kind of pushing themselves to be more efficient?
Yeah, so it's actually kind of multifaceted. There are some environments and industries where it's regulated, and so by law, you're supposed to do a certain amount of offsetting, and so that might be your energy usage or your water usage, et cetera. Really, just depends on where that's located in the specific markets. But generally, what we're focused on in KlimaDAO is what's called the voluntary carbon market. So yes, it's very voluntary. Now, the reason why corporations or organizations just generally do this is because they're feeling this pressure. They're feeling the pressure from their consumers, who studies show are increasingly deciding brands that demonstrate some kind of climate positive or environmental stance. The employees, as you poll them, you realize that employees are increasingly deciding where they're going to work based on how they understand their employer's stance on environmental issues. And then just generally, like we're all feeling it. Like we're all feeling it in ourselves, right? Like, so even the executive staffs, like when they go home and they look at their children, like we're all kind of generally feeling it now.
Yeah,
and
I'd imagine the people sitting outside in 105-degree weather right now are feeling it for sure.
Yeah, like all these high record-breaking temperatures.
Yeah,
like we're feeling it, and so yes, the IPCC and other organizations that study this, everyone is very much focused on this two-prong approach, which is making sure that organizations become more efficient in the materials and how they operate. But even when you account for all that, so real smart people will model that out, et cetera, even when you count all that, there's still this gap. And that's where the carbon market exists, to help offset and to essentially create the incentive, not just to save forests, but to create new technologies as well, like direct air capture. So subsidizing machines that pull carbon directly from the air, right? And so we're basically looking at how do you bootstrap a market where you have to generate both the demand and the supply at the same time. And the carbon market itself, it's over 10 years old. A lot of that time, it's gone through like a lot of strife. I mean, bootstrapping a market is hard, right?
Yeah.
Especially when you're working on both sides, there's a cold start problem. But now we're starting to get to the point where these standards are being established, where corporations are really starting to buy into this idea, because again, that pressure is forcing them to in a lot of ways. And what's interesting is before you can even start to decide, what type of carbon projects you're going to purchase from and offset, you need to understand your footprint. So as an organization, I mean, each of us as humans, even as people, on average, our yearly footprint, say in the US, is between 15 to 20 tons per year. But as an organization, say a large multinational, this is a big exercise that you have to go through, so you understand, what is your total shipping, and how many flights are you taking, and your materials, et cetera. And once you go through that, you realize that to understand your footprint as an organization, you actually need to understand the footprint of your suppliers, those that are upstream of you and downstream of you. And so what happens is it has this built-in viral coefficient. So in order for me to understand my footprint, I need to know your footprint. And so now we're at a stage where that's actually starting to happen. And so a lot of the largest organizations, they've been understanding their footprint for many years now. But now we're seeing that kind of spread across because they're trying to better understand their footprint through their suppliers, et cetera. And the next question then is like, okay, now that I understand my footprint, what do I do about it? And that's where we start to talk about reduction and then offsetting to make up that gap.
I'm starting to understand or see a bit of a better picture now about why and how blockchain integrates with this, right? Because what you're talking about is a really complex system with a lot of independent organizations, and you're counting on them to reasonably and accurately report their carbon usage so that you can have at least a ballpark correct figure for yourself. And then you have other people depending on you to produce a relatively good figure so that they can make their own ballparks, right? So it makes sense to me why that reporting mechanism might use a blockchain solution by and of itself. But then as we talk about carbon markets, before KlimaDAO and helping to enable this to happen in a cryptocurrency fashion, were people just going on to like TD Ameritrade, or like how are they buying and selling these carbon credits?
Yeah, so that's I think what the important innovation that blockchain really brings to this, and why it represents like a really powerful real world use case. So, firstly, it's important to understand like markets are the best invention humans have created to organize globally and at scale, right? And primarily what that rallies around is price. So what does something cost, right? Because once you understand what something costs from moment to moment, then you can actually start to model it, and you can start to predict, and then you're able to play with reality, and you're able to operate in a more realistic way, right? So the voluntary carbon market, what I refer now to the legacy carbon market, is to give you an idea. If you wanted to source carbon, once you understood your footprint, you would typically need to employ several people that were experts in the space, so-called like carbon desk. You would go out to the carbon market, you would work with various brokerages, and they would work with you to source various projects. This process could take anywhere from a month to several months to do. On top of it, because the market is so opaque and the liquidity is so distributed across many different types of projects, on-the-ground projects, the middlemen have this opportunity to mark up the costs. And so we see markups traditionally anywhere from 30% to 300% and more, right? And the trick is since there's not really a transparent market there in the legacy market, then you, as a participant, you don't really understand the value of what you're paying for. And so this is where blockchain comes in, right? And so as we tokenize these credits, we bring them on chain, and then we set up liquidity pools for them, right? So these are instant swaps for them, and now you allow the market to decide what the price is at any moment. And this is exactly what's happened. So as I said, we created this incentive to bridge over 25 million tons on chain, and in that process, we established tens of millions of dollars of liquidity. $2 billion worth of transactions. And this is by far this is the deepest amount of liquidity for carbon assets anywhere, on chain or off chain, right? And that really speaks to the power of blockchain, not just from the transparency aspect and then the built-in DeFi market aspects we have, but it really speaks to the power of scale.
That's absolutely wild to me. I mean, liquidity pools, we start to kind of delve into the land of DeFi and whatnot, but maybe could you give a lightweight explainer on what is a liquidity pool? Like what is that utility that it provides?
Yeah, I mean, essentially, it's like, imagine you have two tokens. Doesn't matter what they are. Just say you have two tokens or two assets, and the liquidity pool is a set of code that maintains a ratio between them. So if you have one of those tokens and you want one of the other tokens, you essentially send that token into that contract, and based on the ratio, you'd get a certain number of the other token back out. And so these are so-called automated market making functions. And so essentially, it's a way to conduct a trade without an intermediary. It's it's just being guided by code essentially.
Right.
And so you have SushiSwap and Uniswap, and so all of these pools on there are essentially that. What KlimaDAO did, instead, beyond just providing the incentive to bring carbon on chain, was we created an incentive for participants to bond not just the carbon into the Klima treasury, but the liquidity provider tokens. And in this way, Klima as a DAO is now owns the vast majority of the carbon liquidity. Which is very important, because then it allows us as a community to vote on how we optimize those liquidity pools, how we incentivize the market in certain ways to essentially trade this carbon. And
if I could pause for just a beat, because this is a really complex financial topic, right? And I don't want to rabbit hole on it too much, but if I understand it correctly, the utility that the liquidity pool and automated market maker provide is that you can have a marketplace that's open 24 hours, and that if I want to buy something or if I want to sell something, I don't have to wait until the buyer or seller is lined up on the opposite side. Like if we go back to the olden days, if I had a gallon of goat's milk, I would have to like pretty quickly get that to the marketplace and then hope that there's somebody else that has like, you know, some basket of bread that I want.
Right.
And then have an exchange. That has to happen live. You have to have a buyer and a seller there live. And what the liquidity pool allows me to do is say, hey, I've got goat's milk, and like put it out there, and then anybody can swing by later and buy some, right? Like that's the rough idea.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And so when you talk about these automated swapping, the important factor is the amount of liquidity, right? So the amount of liquidity then provides in proportion like how large of a trade you could do before it starts impacting price. So, you know, if you have very narrow or shallow liquidity, then if you do a sizable trade, then you're going to experience high slippage, which means for every incremental token that you purchase, the price is going to move up a lot more. Now, if you have deeper liquidity, then that movement is less, essentially, and you have less slippage. And so that really is like an indicator of the health of that pool, essentially, is how deep the liquidity is.
So when you're talking about the liquidity pool that you all provided through KlimaDAO, you had, remind me again, it was like 25 million? Was that right?
Yeah, so I mean, it fluctuates with price.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think we're on the order of magnitude of like 30 to 40 million right now, something like that, of total liquidity.
So if I wanted to buy like $1 million worth of carbon offset credits, it wouldn't really kill the price.
No, you would experience pretty low slippage.
Yeah. So versus in other markets, that wouldn't necessarily be the case, because in like the legacy market, as you were saying, they might not have that much liquidity in any given case.
Yeah, and even if they did, you wouldn't know what you're being marked up on, right? And so that's really, you know, speaks again to like the total impact that this money can have, right? So, you know, as you know, insofar as you are trying as an organization or even as an individual, you're trying to do the right thing, and you're trying to incentivize on the ground impact or projects to have a positive impact. You don't know if, you know, 70% of your money is going towards that or 50%. And so, you know, with blockchain, what we've done is we've taken a process that takes 3 months to clear with markups of 30 to 300%. And we've made that instant with just only a couple percent of, you know, you're paying transaction fees. So, you know, it's a huge increase in efficiency, not just in the experience itself, but in terms of the actual impact of what's happening.
That's absolutely wild to me. I'm going to take a little bit of a non sequitur for a second, right? Because we've been talking a lot about carbon markets and liquidity pools and how they all function. And I wanted to kind of bring it back to NFTs, right? So, you know, over the last, 2 years or so, I think we've seen more news about the climate impact of cryptocurrency as a whole. And I think one of the things that we were kind of promising to tell people about today in some regard is what can we do to make sure that the work that we all do in the cryptocurrency community has a reasonable impact, right? I was wondering if you might be able to speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. So, you know, in Web3, I mean, we're not deaf, right? Like we hear the primary FUD. And I mean, the good news is we, at Klima, we have the opportunity to work with a lot of NFT projects, a lot of other Web3 projects. And the good news is that we do see that Web3 itself is trying very hard to be not just carbon neutral, but climate positive. And climate positive essentially means is going beyond just being carbon neutral. So, you know, offsetting more than you actually need to. And so, you know, at this current pace, you know, I would say probably within the next few years, we would see not just Web3, like a lot of the proof of stake chains and activity being carbon neutral, but, you know, there's already talks about how we can offset the historical impact of BTC and Ethereum, right? And so I'm really encouraged by that. I think, you know, looking forward in a few years, we should be able to state that the crypto impact has been offset, or at least pretty close. When it comes to NFTs themselves, there's some really interesting things, right? And so as a simple way is, as an NFT project, you can just purchase carbon on chain right now and retire it, right? I mean, and that would be one way. And so we have calculators that automatically calculate wallet activity or contract activity, and You can just do that as a manual function if you wanted to. So periodically you would add it up, and just as like a project owner or a community, you'd do that. Or you could automate it. So you could actually bake it into the contracts themselves. And so every time some condition happens or something happens, it goes to the market, it automatically sources and retires that carbon. And so it just becomes an incremental function inherent in the contract itself. That's a possibility. However, about a month ago, a little over a month ago, we worked with Polygon to make their entire chain carbon neutral. And so if you're operating on Polygon right now, you are carbon neutral, and will be moving forward. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't try to also do additional, because you really want to express that climate positivity. But Polygon felt so strongly about this, they actually created a $20 million green fund as part of this collaboration. And so not only is Polygon completely carbon neutral now, they also have this $20 million green fund to basically fund projects that are within kind of like this mashup of like climate, crypto, environment, crypto, these types of things.
That's absolutely wild. Okay, so I think one thing that you brought up was this idea of like being able to build it into the contract itself. And I think that's, if there's like one common thread that I've kind of heard between Matt Halfill, who was here earlier, Katie Geminder, who was just on before you, was this ability for cryptocurrency, and specifically the smart contracts, to like change the nature of collaboration and to change the nature of how we coordinate our work. And here I'm hearing one new version of this, which is it's not just about revenue streams out to individuals and their participation and their alignment of values with the individual projects, but here you're bringing on one new aspect of it, which is how do we think about the world as a whole, and can we do something so that we're not in the business world, we talk about externalities, right? And like you were talking about the cost of production of an item, we have to think about what does it mean to actually like dig the earth to like pull the metal out to like put it into a phone, right? And that's an externality that's affected on wherever the aluminum is, right? Presumably, just as there's carbon markets, you'd think that there's almost an aluminum market that would think carefully about that too, right? What does it mean to like mine aluminum and refine it and manufacture it and get it to an Apple factory? You would want to offset that too, and you could almost align out all of those things right there in the smart contract.
Yeah. So, I mean, smart contracts are like a very native, like low-hanging fruit, where you could integrate because it's already on chain, or most likely, particularly today if it's EVM compatible, right? Like you can implement that very easily, and we're working with projects that do that now. The other big innovation of bringing this, making this market transparent and instant, et cetera, is you start to think about, okay, going beyond smart contracts themselves, but into the real world, right? So how a corporation, all of the operations of our economy now are guided by software. Like software has eaten the world, right? It's here, and so it's about how do you make the environment a stakeholder essentially within that production process. So then you could actually integrate instead of going from like a quarterly or a yearly offset, but a real-time offset. So as your production increases, like almost on time offsetting, right? It's so as certain steps within your production process in the real world occurs, it's calling an API essentially that is offsetting that, whatever that incremental action is. And so I think this is where we start to really drive towards the real possible use case of the large use case of this, and make it again native within the accounting itself.
That's absolutely wild. So when we're talking about NFTs, that's like the movement of electrons between a lot of computers, the computers themselves.
And photons.
Yes, and photons indeed. But that could all be thought through, accounted for, et cetera. Yeah. And be built in as part of the process. I
mean, it's a different kind of like environmental gas fee, right? It's like extending gas. Like there's gas represents the cost it takes to perform an operation. This would be like an extended gas fee of like what the impact of that operation is.
That's really far out.
Wow.
I'm going to throw out a total non sequitur for a beat and just ask, how did you ever get started in crypto?
Yeah, so I mean, I've been in tech a long time, and mostly how I got into it was like pretty early. Like I was on cypherpunk forums and things like that, and so yeah, I mean I mean, it's just that kind of background. So I think a lot of us were always kind of expecting that this would happen. So, you know, this idea that information wants to be free is beautiful. But then eventually, you know, this idea of like, how can you turn value or money into information? And essentially, like, that's in a lot of ways, I think, where Web 2 went wrong, is that we didn't have a real good way to transfer information and value. And so what it created was a bunch of centralized gatekeepers around what it takes to actually do a transaction. So you have Visa, MasterCard, you know, whatever. And so what that meant is the only real way people can make money is through advertising, which created this whole surveillance, de facto surveillance state. And, you know, and it just imagine if we had crypto earlier, right, where you could actually create a transaction for reading something that costs a fraction of a penny, you know, just automatically, right? And so we're still like figuring this out. And I think part of the transition is because the advertising model is so entrenched. And so I've been working in the Web 2 world a lot, and actually I spent quite a bit of time using ML models applied to ad tech, so I know like the ad market very well.
Right.
And so I was always just a hodler, right? I'd accumulate as it started to become a thing. I was like encouraged by that. But I was always really busy, but I kind of just really hit this certain point where the stars aligned, and I was like, you know what, I'm going to actually focus on Web3, and that was about a little over a year ago. Yeah. And I floated around a lot. I worked on various things, just trying to really understand the space, and where could I best apply my skills. And I really love markets. And, especially working in markets, the great thing about it is when you're working in a market, it involves real value, right? Like if you want to test something, if you want to do something, you're actually having to use real value. So it's like really developing at the edge. And so I was really into that. But then when, this idea around Klima, applying this, market mechanisms and blockchain to carbon markets, that's where I was like, oh yeah, this is it. Like, this is totally it. And so I went full time into Klima.
That's mind-boggling to me. So if I heard you correctly, yes, you have a long technical career, but in terms of crypto specifically, you've not been in it for like decades. It's really just been like the last year or so that you've been really full time on putting your like professional efforts onto it. Yeah. And here you are working in KlimaDAO, that's done multiple millions of dollars in operations, right? And then what did you say, like 2 billion in transactions?
Total transaction
total
volume.
Transactions. That's crazy. Yeah. So you don't have to be in it for decades to have like a really incredible impact on not just the cryptocurrency ecosystem, but apparently planet Earth.
Yeah, I mean, imagine like working in a DAO, right? Yeah. Like this is crazy. Like, I like to think of it as, KlimaDAO had this large number, like tens of thousands of people come together in very early days, like we were crashing Discord and things like that. It was really crazy. And so all of a sudden you're struck with like, oh, okay, this is a thing. And like, okay, so what do you do, right? Like, we're a DAO, we're supposed to like self-organize, we're supposed to like do things. And, one of the ways I think about it is, in a traditional startup, it's kind of like an inverted triangle. And so at the bottom, it's like you have a founder, a couple founders, and then they hire like a very select team, and it kind of grows, outward. Right. Whereas in a DAO, it's kind of the reverse. It's just a triangle. And so you start with this wide base of like a community. And then from there, it's like, okay, some of those people coalesce into contributors and how they do it is they just start doing things. They just start acting as if, and they become consistent on it. And then as contributors, you're all kind of feeling each other out. You're like, oh, who are you? What have you done, right? Because we're all pseudo-anonymous, right? We don't know each other, and we're relying less on like our name and our background, because we had early on we had this policy of like try not to dox yourself, right? And so it's like feeling each other out, and over time you build from a large base, and you start to build this pyramid of people that are consistent, that are very skilled. And I mean, I'm constantly surprised, like the caliber of talent that we have within our DAO, right? Of people from companies that everyone has heard of, and they just become very excited around this mission, and so outside of carbon markets and crypto, which are very awesome, like I'm very fascinated by this idea of like what it means to operate from a DAO perspective, and in particular what it means to be a DAO working in the real world. So I have conversations with real world companies where I'm like, hi, I'm Zygy, and they're like, what is this, and it's a really interesting challenge, and I think it's one of the things that really is fascinating to me is like this is a whole new modality of everything.
There's about 15 different threads I could pull out of there, but I'm going to recap on a few that really stuck out to me. One is DAOs grow and become crazy really fast when you've found a match between external values in the outside world, and like it's that audience, right? The ability to capture audience, that you can outgrow your tooling for your DAO really quickly. Another one is the idea that you're all pseudonymous. Like, I don't know your real name. And there's a whole thing to say about that in the crypto community. And then the idea of just DAO it, right? And that's what we would say in the Rare Pizzas Pizza DAO back in the day. It's exactly show up and start doing things. And if you do them on a consistent basis, you're recognized for having done it. I call it kind of performative labor, but it's like performance art, right? In some respects, that you're just kind of showing people that you're doing the work, and you come to be recognized for having done it. It's kind of a whole new world. I would like to do a whole separate talk just about that. I think if I could, but in the interest of keeping our audience from falling asleep, I wanted to kind of just give you a beat to open it up and say, was there anything else you had wished that we had covered in talking about climate and talking about NFTs and talking about cryptocurrency?
No, I would just say, like, anything that anyone is working on, really consider the environmental impact of that. And, there's a real way that you can mitigate now, and you can do that natively on chain. We have a campaign, we have a product called Love Letters. And so if you go to loveletter.cleanitout.finance, you can write a love letter to the planet. We've had, some great people like Mark Cuban, write retirements, and, mothers writing a love letter to their children, like, hey, for the future generations. And so it's really simple. You essentially show up with some USDC, you write how much, you said how much you want to retire, you write your retirement message, your love letter, and it's, exists on the blockchain.
You might have to take a beat and explain, what does retiring the credit mean?
Yeah, so the carbon life cycle of a credit is it gets generated from a project. It exists, it gets traded, especially like say on chain, it gets traded, but eventually it should be consumed. And by consuming is essentially like burning it, but burning it in a very specific way. And when you burn it, you remove that supply. You remove it from the supply, essentially.
I see. Cool.
And so, we have that. And so it's a good way for anyone to kind of get a feeling of like what it means to offset your footprint. So as an individual, I think that's that's the other big thing is not only have we made this more transparent and faster and given a real price to it, but we've opened it not just for big organizations anymore, or even, now we've opened it to small businesses and individuals. So as an individual, your footprint is 15 to 20 tons per year. The current cost of carbon, if you wanted to offset, it's, whatever, it's probably going to cost you like less than $100. Go on there and offset your last year, or your family. It makes a great gift. Write a poem, write a love letter to the planet, right? You can do it now, right?
Yeah, that's awesome. Cool. Before you all do applause, does anybody have any questions for Zygy? Alrighty. Hey, Zygy, everybody.
My pleasure. Thank you.